to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today, we are going to continue our popular Story of Our Loop series, but this one's got a little bit of a twist because our guests today are from Australia, and they came from overseas to do the Great Loop. So more and more, we're getting questions from some foreign nationals who would love to do the Great Loop, but there are some hoops to jump through to stay in the U.S. long enough. And Clive and Anne Arnold will be our guests today, and they'll tell us about how they did it as Australians who were able to come to the U.S. for long enough to complete the Great Loop. Before we jump in, as always, I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And with all of that out of the way, officially welcome to Clive and Anne Arnold. Thank you for joining me all the way from Australia today.
Yeah, thank you, Kim.
Hi, Kim. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you both, too. And we're excited to have you here because, as I said, we get more and more questions about how to accomplish this. And there can be differences from country to country. But you, of course, are two who have figured it out. So let's start with some details about you and your Great Loop. So tell us about how you found out about the Great Loop and what made you decide to come halfway around the world to be able to complete it.
That's probably the question we get asked more than anything. Like, how did we find out about it? And the answer is, we're not really sure. I was aware of it for some years before we actually did it. And we'd been sailing our yacht up and down the east coast of Australia for a few years, and we were thinking to find something different to do, but it had to do with boating. So one day we were anchored into Sundays, and I said, how about we sell a Rami? That was our yacht we'd had for 20 years, sell the cars, put our furniture in storage, rent the house, fly to America, buy a boat, and spend a year or two doing this thing called America's Great Loop. She looked at me and she said, yeah, sounds good, let's go. So that's
Well, I love that adventuresome spirit. So as you said, you sold pretty much everything, decided to come to the U.S., and we'll talk about how you accomplish, buying the boat when you're just arriving here. But first of all, tell us about the boat. What kind of a boat did you do your Great Loop aboard, and what made it the perfect boat for you?
We bought a Mainship 390, which we did a lot of research on the internet, obviously, before we left Australia, and figured that would be a good boat. It was a good length, not too big, not too small. We did want 2 cabins because we thought we'd have guests, and we did have a lot of guests while we were doing it. And as much as anything, it was a sort of boat that there was lots of them. There was a market for them, with a price range. There's a choice. You could pick which one you wanted. And it seemed to us to be a really good boat. And it turned out to be a really good boat for the Loop. I think also being single engine we wanted, and the 5 we wanted, and a trawler style. So it was the perfect boat for the Loop for us.
Yeah, and the Mainships are very popular for the Loop. And of course, coming from Australia to buy a boat, do the Loop, and sell the boat, you certainly had that exit strategy in mind. But everybody, for the most part, will eventually sell that boat. And you're absolutely right that if you are doing that, rather soon after the Loop, then considering that on the front end and picking something like a Mainship that there's going to be a market for when you're finished is certainly important. Still focusing a little bit on your specific Great Loop, tell us some of your cruising preferences, like how far you would prefer to travel each day and how fast you cruised, and did you do a lot of anchorages or mostly marinas? How did you approach it?
We cruised at probably between 7 and 8 knots most of the time. And that's a nice speed. We have always been generally anchoring people rather than marinas, and we thought we would on this trip. As it turns out, we changed quite quickly because, the reason for doing the trip primarily was to see America in a way that a lot of people don't see America. And what that meant was we wanted to get off the boat and explore ashore. And lots of places where you wanted to do that is difficult to anchor. So we did end up staying in marinas more than we thought we would. I think we're probably about 60% of the time in marinas or on walls or something if we're up in Canada. So we did stay in marinas more than we expected, but we're pleased that we did. We got to see a lot more, and we got more people too.
Mm-hmm. So tell us some of the highlights that you found along the way. And I'm eager to hear your perspective on this, because coming from so far and not having as much familiarity with the US and Canada as many loopers do, tell us about what you found to be the highlights of the trip.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For us, everything was new and exciting and different. And people often ask us that question, and we say there's no real single highlight. If we had to pick areas, probably the Canadian canals were fabulous. We enjoyed the inland rivers. And it was a real surprise to us, we enjoyed the big cities because we're not city people, but we absolutely loved going to DC, Chicago, New Orleans. Really enjoyed them, which was a big surprise to us. And I think partly because on the marina, you're right in the middle of these places, so it's easy to find your way around, much less intimidating than if you are, staying a long way out. So, yeah, we were surprised by it.
Now, a couple of those cities that you mentioned, Anne, are side trips. Not everyone does the Potomac River to DC. Not too many loopers go to New Orleans. So what made you make those choices? And, how were those side trips?
We went to DC because we were traveling with another boat, and they said they were going up there and encouraged us to go. And we thought, oh, it's a long way up and back. No. They said, no, you've got to go. They used to work there. So we'll show you around. So we did, and we were so pleased we went up there. Mm-hmm. We absolutely had a ball. Spent a week there. And we walked to lots of the Smithsonian's and really had a good look around. So that worked really well. Mm-hmm. And we enjoyed going to the Potomac as well. New Orleans, that was a side trip, but again, it was, I'm not even sure why we went there. I think we just thought, we
had just at the time.
Yeah.
And it just felt like somewhere that we wouldn't otherwise go. Mm-hmm. And so we had, I think, 4 days there.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting, and we're so pleased we went. Yeah. So I think that Anne's right. The to go up to DC was a trip, and again, we thought we wouldn't enjoy it, but it was fantastic.
Yeah.
New Orleans was great. Chicago we had a few days in Chicago. So yeah, they were a surprise to us.
Yeah. And it is, even for people who have visited some of those cities, it really is a completely different experience when you arrive on the water. And you're, as you said, Anne, you're staying at a marina, perhaps in the heart of everything. So I'm thrilled that you got a chance to experience those things. How long did it take you to do your loop from start to finish?
We started in February, and then we went through to December when we came back to Australia for Christmas. And then we went back again a couple months later, and then we did a little bit more to finish the loop. Mm-hmm. And then we carried on after we crossed our way in Stewart in Florida, and then we continued on up to the Chesapeake. So we did the loop in a bit, and we were very close to keep going and doing it. So I got to say, we loved it.
We nearly kept going and did it again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in the end, we couldn't.
Well, and I definitely want to dive into and spend a good bit of our time on how you made that work from a customs and immigration standpoint, because a lot of non-US citizens kind of struggle with how to make that happen. So I think this would be a good time to take a quick break and play a message from some sponsors. And then we'll kind of switch gears and talk about logistically how you planned and did this from Australia as Australian citizens who perhaps had some hoops to jump through to stay in the US for that long. So we'll take a break and we'll be back in a moment. Life is better by the bay. Here in Panama City, Florida, we have deep blue water surrounded by arts and culture. We love our historic neighborhoods, southern coastal cuisine, and the songs and stories of our locals. And we're sure you will too. If you're traveling along America's Great Loop, drop your anchor at St. Andrews Bay in Panama City and enjoy easy access to waterfront restaurants and shopping, a favorite among loopers. Land or water, you're going to love it here. Visit destinationpanamacity.com and learn more. Cross Country Boat Transport has been a family-owned company since 1991. We have 3 drivers with boatloads of experience transporting over-dimensioned power and sailboats around the lower 48 states. If your perfect looping boat is on the wrong coast, give us a call or send us an email. We'll be happy to discuss transport and answer any questions you may have. Check out our website at crosscountryboat.com, where you can request a quote, view our gallery, and read testimonials from past customers. We're also the go-to for mass transport down to Mobile for our sailing loopers. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guests today are Anne and Clive Arnold. They are Australians who are also gold loopers, and it's a great story that they were able to find out about the loop. They were able to plan their loop and navigate not only the loop itself, but navigate the system that we have a pretty complicated system, I think, here in the US of customs and immigration rules for people who are coming to visit. So tell us, how were you able to stay in the US for long enough to complete the loop? You mentioned a trip back to Australia. Was that because you wanted to be there for the holidays, or were you kind of out of time and had to exit the country again? So how does that all work?
Well, we applied for and got what's called a B2 visitor visa, which allows us multiple entries to the US for 5 years and up to 6 months each time. We had to go to Melbourne to get interviewed at the consulate in Melbourne to get that visa, and that was fine because we had a letter from you saying how much time we needed to do this trip and so on, which was quite helpful. So we got the B2 visa. It is still dependent on the customs or the immigration person when you arrive, how long they give you. But we had essentially no trouble. They just gave us 6 months each time. In the first year, our 6 months ran out when we were in Canada, because we started in the Keys in Florida, and our 6 months ran out when we were a couple of days before crossing back into the US. And to get it renewed, you have to be, our understanding anyway, is that you have to be out of the US to get it renewed. If we'd been back in the US, we would have had a problem. As it was, we were able to go and get another 6 months renewal from we were in Sault Ste. Marie, which then took us all down the inland rivers to Florida. And as I said, we went back to Australia for Christmas for a couple of months. When we came back from there, we had another 6 months and we went back up to the Chesapeake. As far as Canada is concerned, we have, I'm pretty sure about this, we have, as Australians, 6 months visa-free entry into Canada. So whenever we've gone into Canada, they're not fussed about us at all, and we pretty much get 6 months straight off the bat. So the first thing to do for us was we had to be out of America to get it, but it didn't seem to be a problem. And since then, we've been back to America a few times, and it hasn't really been any kind of issue to get 6 months.
Mm-hmm. And so, go ahead, Anne. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say there is a difference between trying to extend a visa and totally renew it. And we were told that because our visa, first our own, had actually expired, they were happy to give us a whole new one for 6 months. Had it not expired and we wanted to extend it, that is quite different. That's when you have to apply and pay money, and it's a bit more uncertain, I think. So for us, the timing was perfect. Starting the kids, that gives you 6 months to get all the way around before you want to come back into the US. The visa's expired and you start again. So that was I'm not sure we planned it that way, but luckily that turned out really well.
But that could definitely work for a lot of foreign nationals interested in doing the Great Loop, because going to Canada does count as exiting the country. Obviously, you're going to a different country. And then you to get the new visa and basically restart that 6 month clock, that happens at the border when you're re-entering the US, correct? There's nothing you have to do, like, for example, while you're in Canada on the loop. You just exit the country, spend some time in Canada, and then re-enter, and it starts the 6 month clock again. Is that your experience?
It was, although we actually went in person before we tried to go in. take the boat in just to check it all out, just to make sure, because we were a bit uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
And then that worked in our favour, because then they actually could do it, a proper border crossing. Whereas on the boat, you just call up on the iPad. So I think going in person and seeing them explaining it probably helped. And then once we had our 6 months there, just better going and calling up on the phone and the iPad to actually get the boat and us in.
One thing that we were never able to find out, and still don't know, is how long we have to be out of the US before you are allowed to re-enter. And we cannot find an answer to that anywhere. One customs guy said to us, well, if you left America, went to the Canadian border, and they wouldn't let you in and you came back, that wouldn't count as being long enough. But I mean, we were in, we had been in Canada for a couple of months by the time our visa ran out, when we were in Sault Ste. Marie. So it had only been expired for a couple of days at that point. So yeah, how long you have to be out, we don't really know.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that that is defined either. At least I know for Canadian citizens visiting the US, there is no mandatory waiting period. They also get 6 months. Or is it a year? I forget for Canadians now, but there is also no mandatory waiting period for re-entering. So it is, it certainly makes it more doable. And as you started off with, Clive, it all depends on that customs or immigration agent that's interviewing you at the border when you try to cross in. And most of them, they're not looking for loopers. They're not trying to trip us up and give us a hard time. So, I don't know of issues that people have had at the border, as long as they're doing their best to follow the regulations. So I'm glad that you had a good experience and that the timing worked. But of course, there's several opportunities for anybody else considering this to leave the US during the loop. And one is to head over to the Bahamas. Another is to go to Canada, as you did. And I've even heard some Canadians, but other foreign nationals discussing the possibility of actually visiting Cuba to leave the country. As American citizens, that's harder for us to do, to go to Cuba. But when you're down in the Florida Keys, you are not far if you're looking to reset that visa clock. And it certainly is possible to cruise over there on most Great Loop boats. So, and I think another challenge that a lot of people, particularly from as far away as you are, is finding and buying that boat, because particularly, once you enter the country, you are on a 6-month clock and you have to leave and re-enter. So if it takes a while to find that boat, where do you stay while that's happening? How do you go about all that? So how close were you to purchasing the boat before you arrived? Did you already kind of have your sights set on a listing, or how did that work out for you?
Well, we had pretty much decided we wanted a Mainship 390 or 350, and we had an eye on one on the west coast of Florida, which we were using Michael Martin as a vice broker, and we had our eye on one on the coast. I said we had surveyed and hauled out that, and we decided not to buy it because the boat had been left for a while, and there was a little thing. So we thought, none of these are big things, but it would take some time to get them sorted. So we passed on that. Then we found one on the east coast of Florida that had been well prepared for the loop. The people doing it, well, the people who owned it, had intended to do the loop, but for some reason they couldn't carry on and do it. So the boat was in good shape. So when we flew in, we landed in Fort Lauderdale on a Wednesday, saw the boat on a Friday, decided to have it surveyed, which took 2 weeks to organise. So in that 2 weeks, we hired a car and did a circumnavigation of Florida by car, staying in dodgy motels, and then surveyed the boat on the Friday, decided to buy it on Friday, and kind of from all your documentation, sorted out that part of it really quickly. So we settled and moved into the boat the following Wednesday, so like 3 or 4 days later. And we left on our first day of the loop 9 days after that. It was the first time we drove the boat. So it was our first day of the loop. So it was all pretty quick, but the boat was marvelous. It was reliable and comfortable, and we were very pleased with our choice. Yeah.
And then after the loop, when you went to sell the boat again, did you stay in the States while it was while that process was happening, or did you head back to Australia and let brokers handle that for you?
No, what we did, we left the boat on the west coast of Florida, so we hadn't quite crossed our way when we went home for Christmas because it was much cheaper to leave it on the west coast than the east coast.
Mhm.
So when we came back at the beginning of the next year, we just crossed through Lake Okeechobee and crossed our way, and then we went back up to the Chesapeake, and we spent a couple of months in the Chesapeake because the first year we more or less zipped through in the grey and the rain and the mist and hardly saw anything. So we spent a couple of months there, and on the way we had the boat in the loop trawling at Norfolk,
Mm-hmm.
and a couple that came on board during then actually bought the boat from us in the Chesapeake when we got up there. So that was pretty straightforward for us.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad that worked out well. So,
Yeah.
so as non-US citizens buying a US flagged boat, did you have to, how does that work from a legal standpoint? Do you have to do anything? Did you have to flag the boat as Australian, or did you leave it US flagged? What kind of technicalities did you have to deal with on that end, especially knowing the boat would be leaving the US and going to Canada and coming back?
Yeah, so because the boat, when we bought it, was US documented, we had to undocument it because we were not allowed to be Australians not have it documented. So we undocumented it, but then because it was a US boat, we registered it in Delaware. And so because it was a US boat, we didn't have to check in, we could go where we want, and it was no problem at all. So we found that was the easiest. And there was no reason for us to have it registered in Australia. We obviously weren't going to bring it back here, and it would have made it very complicated when we sold it. So leaving it as a boat registered in the US but not documented is easy.
Interesting. I didn't know that is how that would work, but that does seem like it would very much simplify it. So I'm glad that went well as well. What about insurance? I've gotten some questions from people about insuring a boat if they don't have a US address. Did you run into any insurance obstacles?
You can do that.
No, not really. We've been boating together for 55 years, so we've got quite a lot of experience. So our boating resume is pretty solid. We used a sponsored broker on AGLCA, and we got insurance with no difficulty at all. So for us, it was quite straightforward. I guess because we have a fair bit of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And we should add that it might be different now because obviously insurance has got a lot tighter in the last couple of years. So everything that we're saying is what happened to us, but might be different.
Right. And that is a good point. Thank you for making sure that was clear to everybody. The other thing that I think is complicated, particularly for our Canadian members who are bringing their Canadian boat across the border into the US for an extended period of time, is that they have to check in with Customs and Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection along the way as they're hitting different regions and different areas. And that is always time consuming, challenging. You didn't have to do that, though, I'm guessing, because the boat remained US registered. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, saved us all back. It was really good.
Yeah, we didn't have to get a cruising permit or anything like that, so
right.
We didn't have to report it to anybody. That worked fine.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. It almost seems like it's easier for you to come and do this as Australians than it is for Canadians to just drive their boat across the border. So I'm glad we're making it easier for our Australian friends, but perhaps we could make it a little bit easier for our Canadian friends too. But that is all great information. I'm thrilled that there weren't as many hoops for you to jump through as many of us would imagine. Like I said, we've been getting more and more interest in the loop from overseas. And with that comes a lot of questions on how to do these things. So I also know it can be different by country. Not every country is eligible for the B2 type visa that you got, but most are. So just going back to a little bit more generalities, what advice do you have for people considering the Great Loop at all, but especially if they are coming from overseas to do it?
I think our advice would be don't overthink it. Just get out there and do it. because a lot of people have said to us, "Oh, I'd like to go and do that," and we say to them, "Well, why don't you go and do it?"
Right.
So yeah, don't overthink, just get on and do it. With us, the hardest bit that was the most not so difficult and worrying was before we left home. So trying to think about how is this going to work? How would we buy a boat? How would the visas work? Setting that all up. Even just things like how do we get weather forecasts in a different country? How do we know about any notice navigation and things like that? Once we actually got there and got on the boat, then because we have a lot of boating experience, that was then easy. It was just a series of day trips. And we started off fairly gentle and did a few fairly easy little trips and then just got going. So yeah, don't overthink it. Just get out there and make sure that you do it. I mean, it was a fabulous year.
It was.
Yeah, that is great advice. So just to wrap up, what other adventures, what have you been up to since you finished the loop? Are you still boating and are you still traveling extensively?
Yes, and yes. when we just briefly, when we finished the loop, we sold the boat in the Chesapeake, bought a motorhome and spent a few months traveling around America in the motorhome in Seattle in March 2020 when, everything went pear-shaped. And so we came home and after a little while we bought a boat, a sailboat, which we lived on for 2 years and sailed up and down the east coast in Queensland. And then we sold that, went back to America last year, 2023, bought a motorhome again and travelled through Alaska and Canada and Yukon, Northwest Territories and so on. And then at the beginning of, in April 2024, we bought a Bayliner 3988 in Southeast Alaska, and we have spent this summer cruising Southeast Alaska. We've left the boat in Southeast Alaska. We'll go back there next spring and spend 6 months, a little bit more in Alaska, and then down through BC to Washington, to Seattle, Puget Sound. And then our plan is to sell the boat at the end of next season down in the Seattle area. So yeah, we still voting.
Yeah, well, I admire your adventuresome spirit, and I would love to go to all of the places that you just mentioned and do some boating in them. So, Clive and Anne, thank you for sharing your story with us today. It's really been enlightening. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who's watched or listened today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.